Hello and welcome back. I'm Steve Clemens, editor-at-large of The Hill. Thanks for joining us for our Diversity and Inclusion Summit. We're spending the day talking about why diversity and inclusion matter and the essence of meaningful rather than fake change. In this, the second portion of our event, we're going to turn our attention to diversity and why it's good for business. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Qualcomm, the International Franchise Association, and the National Association of Realtors for their support of today's program. Special thanks to the International Franchise Association for supporting this session. We're going to have some great franchisors in just a moment. It's no secret that diversity in business has real impact on the bottom line. Studies are showing more and more that diversity helps correct a lot of blind spots firms have. So what are the best practices for how business leaders can bring diversity into their workplaces? What resources should be provided to support small businesses and minority entrepreneurs or young businesses? How can opening a business for myself become an American dream for more minorities? And what are the ways that society and popular culture can influence change in the workplace? We'll seek answers to all these questions and more, but before we get underway, a few housekeeping reminders. Tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag TheHillDiversity. We're broadcasting live. Please send in your questions. We'll be taking them through the program. And if you experience any trouble with the live stream, just refresh the page, and hopefully that will refresh things and reset things and make things great. There are nearly 31 small businesses in the United States, and only 8 million are owned by minorities. How do we get those numbers up? What steps are being taken to tackle the wealth gap and create economic opportunity? Let's hear from those who have carved a path for themselves. Carolyn Thurston is the founder and CEO of Wisdom Senior Care, a business that she started in 2006. And Claudia San Pedro is president of Sonic Brand. I mean, this is so cool. You're both cool, both really cool, but look, I mean, Sonic. Prior to Sonic, she was the first female and the first Hispanic to serve as director of state finance for Oklahoma. So I got a little bit of a disclosure. My Sonic is on 271 Southwest Adams Boulevard in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. So, so I'm a Barshan, by descent. I'm in D.C. now, but that is my go-to. So anyway, great to have you both here. Let me start with you, Carolyn. I know that you're in home health care. It's not an area that I would have thought that would have lent to franchise, but you're changing the game there. So tell us a little bit, not just about your business and the fact that you've now, I think, franchised out in this process. But I'd also like to get a short form take of what didn't you know when you're going to do this? What hurdles did you have to overcome that were blindside, came in and you kind of knocked off?
Thank you. Just getting started, some of the hurdles that I faced personally was the educational piece. The educational piece about business, how to even set up a structure. Should I be a sole proprietor? Should I do a partnership? And at the time, I had no idea about franchising. So I had to, I just had a dream. I just had a passion that I could help take care of the senior population. So with that, I stepped out, and then I ran into the hurdle of finances, capital. That became one of the biggest struggles as far as being able to start my business. I would go to a bank. I couldn't get a loan, couldn't get any type of financing to be able to assist me into getting my business started. So I would say the biggest hurdles that I found was the educational piece. But as I started my journey, I started meeting people who started to open my eyes up to franchise.
We may have just lost you there for a moment, but we will be back to Carolyn.
Let me jump to where has this been?
Go ahead. Sorry. No, please go ahead. We just lost you for a second with your broadband, but please continue.
Yeah, so once we learned what franchising was, we were able to really embrace it fully. And to our surprise, this wasn't something new, but it was a form of building a business and creating wealth. It was a different way of doing that. And so we were introduced to that. And now we have a mission as a brand to help other individuals be able to do the same thing by owning their own business.
Well, it's fascinating. And before I jump to Claudia, Carolyn, let me ask you, because I know how hard it is to launch something from scratch and new. You're now running a business. How do you balance the demands from others who want to know what you did, to follow those patterns? How do you straddle that? Because you've got to get employees, train them, keep your different shops running at the quality and standard you want. But now, because you've broken through in ways that others hadn't, everybody wants to know your secret sauce.
Right. So that's where franchising comes in, right? Because I have this natural desire to be able to help other people. But franchising gives us the opportunity to be able to share these proven systems with others so that they don't have to go through the heartaches that we had to go through. We can help them, we can direct them on how to get employees. And you asked the biggest question. I don't do this by myself. We have a team. We have a support team locally with the Wisdom brand that's there to be able to help our franchisees as they come in, to be able to direct them to what type of lendings, places that they can go, what type of education, where to find caregivers, where to find clients. So there's a whole system that is behind us. And when our franchisees come in, what they find is they're not going to be by themselves. We're going to be right alongside of them throughout the journey. And that's what I'm finding with a lot of people who want to start their own business. They get started, but being able to be truly a scalable business, they lose sight because they find they're by themselves.
I'm so inspired by that. Claudia, so I want to tell our audience here, you've got just a big arena, big playground. You've got, I interviewed Jimmy John Leotoad a long time ago, but Jimmy John's, Buffalo, Wild Wing, Sonic Drive-In, Rusty Taco. I love the Sonic. So anyway, that's there. But I'm just fascinated. You're a C-suite executive, and I think one of the things I mentioned, and perhaps too cavalierly, that people all know that having women in the C-suite, having women on your board, having folks of color, having every diverse element solves blind spots, and that should be obvious. The truth is, it's not obvious out there to a lot of folks, and I'm just interested in, how have you navigated this way forward when, in fact, I don't think a lot of the American business community is where you are in terms of diversity and commitment to that. How is it running one of the largest franchise operations in the country from your perspective?
Well, I think I'm going to give you an example of just one way that as a blind spot where it was and how we've evolved and how we continue to evolve. At Sonic, what I would share with you is one of the things we're known for from a menu perspective is variety. And we are very unique in our competitive space because 40% of what we sell is actually drinks and ice cream, which is very different because we are typically considered a hamburger chain. The reason I bring that up is because if you look at the primary consumer of our drinks, and to a certain extent ice cream, it's a female consumer. So we skew more female from a consumer base than some of our competition. And the example I would give you is I think we've had an iconic creative campaign for so long that was really effective. And they did a wonderful job. And I don't know if you all are familiar with that, but the two guys, very funny, improvisational, they're just masterful. Right. But if you notice, the two guys happen to be white and there's no woman as we talk about that. So as we talked about revamping that campaign, I think a really important perspective that we had been missing was, hey, as we look at who we serve in our drive-ins and we talk about who we are and our core values, which are respect, relationships as a way of life, entrepreneurial spirit, are we really representing all of our consumers, all of our employees and team members? And certainly when we looked at our creative campaign, that just wasn't coming across. So I think as we worked and we just launched the new creative campaign in March of this year, we went from this is how you Sonic to this is how we Sonic. And one of the primary objectives was really to represent families from across the United States that look like the United States and eat at Sonic, to make sure that everyone could relate and felt accessible, that we are representing who our consumer actually is. And I use that as an example because I think a perfect example of a blind spot is you've got an initiative that may be working well for you, and sometimes it's hard to move away from those, but is not representative and is not bringing out the best of who your brand is or who your company is. And so as we think about each of our respective roles, whether you're a person of color or a woman and how you navigate that, it takes a long time. And once you get into those conversations, raising questions, building awareness, to then hopefully make some progress on whether it's a business initiative or, whether it involves development, recruitment, or retention.
That's fascinating. I want to ask you both a question, and I might make it messy. I don't pre-program. I wing most of this. So, I think the question I have is when Carolyn was talking about when she had this idea, she cared about elder care, but there were roadblocks. Capital and finance got turned down by a bank, and the banks that she went on to, so she had to find another way out there. And that's part of entrepreneurship, right? One road closes, you figure out a way around it. Mm-hmm. But I guess my question to you is when I look at franchises, one of the reasons I love them is that both at the owner level, they're often entrepreneurs trying to build business and capital and wealth, like Carolyn said. On the other hand, they employ people who are often, these are their first time jobs. Or they may be employing elders. A friend of mine at AARP said, look, the future of retirement is work. And so a lot of these people work out, in the Sonics and the franchises in a different way out there. Mm-hmm. And I'm interested in, maybe this is too much command and control, but to what degree do you feel that you have a responsibility to make sure that the workforce gets those opportunities for first jobs, or elder care get their jobs and there's respect built in, or owners and franchisees, look like America, as you just said, Claudia. So let me start with Caroline and jump to Claudia.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that helps with the diversity piece of, even as we're bringing on our franchisees, it's always been our focus to be very diverse. And that's when each person goes back to their local community, they're going to affect that community differently. They're going to affect those people that are like them. They're going to offer job opportunities, incentive programs, career pathways that are going to help open up the doors for many more people and just changing their local community one person at a time.
Claudia, what are your thoughts on that front?
I couldn't agree with you more, Stephen, as I think about particularly, we've been having a lot of these conversations on the fact that when employees come to us, it is many times their first job experience. And so we have a special and unique responsibility to really, because we create and shape what their view of their potential and their future career growth plans may be. And so as we embarked this past year, we retooled our training, and we are embarking Inspire-wide on a People First initiative to really look at not just how we train people, but looking at how we attract our new employees and looking at how we develop them and provide them the tools and resources and be very explicit and be much more proactive about presenting career paths to them. And I'll just highlight a couple of examples that may not seem that I think are applicable in different ways. Oftentimes, we just accept the job descriptions we have, and we don't take the time to read over them and notice, are we unnecessarily limiting ourselves and limiting our talent pool? What are the true skills and skill set that we need to make this successful? And it just at a entry level perspective, do I really need a finance major, or do I need someone who can do math, who's got critical thinking capabilities, and who may be an engineering major or a math major? So how do we open up the aperture on how we look at attracting talent? And then as we look to develop and train, are we being sensitive and are we developing a culture of belonging? Is the language we use, are the policies we have, is the development that we have, ensuring that we can continue to develop people in the best of ways and show them a career path forward. And so we're engaged on a number of different initiatives to do just that.
I love it. So I want to take an audience question, but Claudia, I take it you're probably down near Oklahoma City?
Yes.
Sorry about that. Go north a little bit. Have you ever been to Bartlesville?
Yes, actually, I haven't. And we just went this past summer and stayed at the Price Tower at the Frank Wright building.
Guys, for those of you watching, if you get a chance, go to Bartlesville, Oklahoma. That's a Frank Lloyd Wright skyscraper, his only one in Bartlesville, Oklahoma. Anyway, it was just too close a coincidence. So let me, we've got a question from Lourdes. Lourdes Aceves is the Associate Director of Digital Programs at the Urban Libraries Council. Lourdes? Oops, we lost Lourdes. Lourdes? It's coming back.
Hi.
Hi.
My name is Lourdes Aceves, and I'm the Associate Director for Digital Programs at the Urban Libraries Council in Washington, D.C. And my question for you is, who do you envision as ideal community partners to help connect potential entrepreneurs with the knowledge, tools, and ideas they need to advance their economic hopes and dreams? Thank you.
Great question. Carolyn, tell us how you take that.
So I think with that, it has to start out with the educational systems or institutions that we currently have, whether those are our universities, those are our technical schools, proprietary schools, any type of avenue, the small business associations, those are great strategic partners, as well as our churches, because a lot of times churches in the local community, they have various programs as far as to be able to direct people who want to look at business ownership. So those would be some of the strategic partners I would suggest.
Thank you. Claudia, your thoughts on that? And Claudia, I'm going to give you the last word here, but I want you also to answer that question, but also tell me, is there anything, what's the most important thing the public policy community needs to hear from the franchise world?
Okay. I think I would echo what Carolyn said, which is the educational component, and those partners are critically important to success. I would also add that one of the issues we have, and Carolyn mentioned this, is access to capital. So how do we engage with our community banks who live in the communities that we serve, that are elbow to elbow with some of these entrepreneurs? And how do we sit down and have conversations about how we get them access to capital and provide the resource and the infrastructure they need to be successful over time? Because it may look a little different than what we are used to, and versus what we've done in the past, traditionally and conventionally. And then, Steve, I want to make sure I answer your last question.
What does this D.C. town need to understand in here? What's the most important thing they ought to know from I sit among a lot of politicians, right? What do they not get that they need to get?
I think on franchising, here's what I would leave you with, which may seem obvious, but I cannot emphasize this enough, is that oftentimes franchising may be seen as a big company or big brand business. The reality is, and in our case, 96% of our drive-ins are owned by independent business people that started off as grill cooks, as car hops, small businesses. In some cases, they've grown them. In some cases, they've left them at 7 or 9 units. I think this is important for public policy people to understand, because we are one of the primary segues to economic success and security for many entrepreneurs. And we help mitigate their risk and help create success for them. So as we build and continue to think about wealth creation for the United States and talk about small businesses being the backbone of that, when we think of small businesses, it's important that we include the franchising community and infrastructure in that definition, because we do so much to help small businesses. And whether it's the entrepreneur in Oklahoma City, or a first-generation immigrant, or a first-generation college student, we are a critical component of that economic wealth creation.
Thank you. Carolyn, do you disagree? Do you have any?
No, I agree totally with what she said. Just remember, and I think as you started out, people don't realize that home care itself is a franchise. Most people think of restaurants and things. So there's probably in your local area quite a bit of franchises, small business owners that are truly operating there.
Well, listen, this has been a wonderful conversation. I really appreciate it. I feel, it's just great. Carolyn Thurston, founder and CEO of Wisdom Senior Care. Claudia San Pedro, president of the Sonic brand, which I patronize as much as I can. Great to see you both. I hope you'll come back. This was fun. We can go in a lot of different directions, but thank you very much for sharing your thoughts.
We'd love to come back. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you. And now it's time for a message from the sponsor of this session today, and the entire program, actually, the International Franchise Association.
Hi, my name is Ursa Jackson. I am the chair of the IFA Diversity Institute. I'm also a partner at the law firm of Clark Hill. The International Franchise Association is the largest membership organization representing franchising, including franchisors, franchisees, and franchise suppliers. The International Franchise Association's Diversity Institute is working to accelerate the mission of franchising by promoting and fostering diversity and inclusion within the franchise community. I am joined today by Daniel Hapern, who is the CEO and co-founder of Jackmont Hospitality, which owns many TGI Fridays restaurants. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you so much.
Now, franchising offers a host of benefits for entrepreneurs. Walk us through some of the benefits of franchising as a strong business model.
I think for a lot of us that get started in the business, that maybe perhaps come from an operational background, franchising gives you kind of that back office administrative support as well as a brand. And it really allows us to go do what we do best, which is operate day in, day out. Having the benefit of a larger entity that can help you drive revenue, that has some policies and procedures in place. And it kind of allows you to, I guess for lack of a better expression, kind of slow walk the overall entrepreneurial path. And as you you get more involved and you understand your business more, depending on what it is, then you start doing things on your own. So I really think it's a good way for people that have an entrepreneurial bug, but perhaps don't possess all the skills. It's a great way to get started in business for yourself.
Excellent. Now I want to shift and focus a little bit on minority communities because that's certainly a big focus of the Diversity Institute. What are some misperceptions about franchising, particularly as it relates to minority communities?
I think, Ursa, that's obviously a great question, but a loaded question. Our company is about 26 years old. I had the pleasure of starting with a gentleman by the name of Maynard Jackson, who's kind of a legendary mayor in America and holds a very kind of particular hot place in a lot of people's heart in the minority business community, because he was so passionate about people of color having the opportunity to create businesses and obviously to create wealth. And we could go back through history and have a longer, much broader conversation on that. We'll save that for a later date. But I think the notion is that, once again, in a country like America, where working class, middle class people drive the economy, we need more people spending. And his thought always was that, the best thing was a job, right? Get an education and get a job. And if you can be fortunate enough, let's create jobs. So I think for the larger community of America, the more successful Black and Brown America are, the more successful America is. I think it's even more important today. And I think as we've just gone through, and I hope that we're complete with a interesting presidential race, that, America really needs to focus on its economy. And I think that, once again, the way that Black and Brown America go from an economic perspective in a large degree is the way that America is going to go. So once again, the franchising space gives people an opportunity to start businesses in their communities. And I think we would agree that some of the communities that are underserved with services or Black and brown communities. Well, it's not that there's a lack of economic buying power in those communities. And it's not that there's a lack of competent people that could start businesses. And I think through franchising, it's a great opportunity to take aspiring entrepreneurs, team them up with more successful people in the business world, and everybody else. And rising tide lifts all boats. Everybody does well. The franchisor does well because they brought in new talented franchisees. The communities do well because services that maybe they were driving 15, 20 miles to get are now right in their community. So it's a wonderful way for everybody to kind of move forward.
Excellent. You alluded or referenced a little bit about the new administration. If I could just kind of get your tea leaves about what opportunities you anticipate with the new Biden administration as it relates to franchising.
I think with the president-elect, obviously, yesterday and then today again, he reiterated his support for the second stimulus bill, and a lot of us have been working on that. I've been working with several other colleagues in the minority business community on it in conjunction with the IFA in terms of making sure that as we look at the restaurant industry, that franchised restaurants that are owned by people like me, 20 or less for some of the smaller people, are going to have some advantages, or not advantages, but opportunities through this next bill. So I think those kinds of things are critically important. I think that the Democrats in the House now having the White House will certainly have a little bit more influence with their colleagues in the Senate, where it's still certainly run by the Republicans. And hopefully everybody agrees that, we need the stimulus to keep going. I think we've all seen in the past, 24, 48 hours, nice announcements on vaccines. So maybe there is some light at the end of the tunnel. But I do think that a lot of us in the business space still need some help. I think some of the smaller people were left behind for whatever reason in the first round. And so hopefully we'll have maybe a little better spirit of cooperation in DC to help people in the country, regardless of political affiliation. And maybe, there's a period of time here where maybe we'll take country over party. I'm cautiously optimistic, but I hope that's the case. And I know that the vice president is very optimistic that can be the case. So let's hope that we can move forward and ensure that businesses that were around pre-COVID will be around post-COVID.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for your insights, and thank you for your commitment to diversity and inclusion in franchising. We certainly at the Diversity Institute thank you for helping us foster our goal of diversity and inclusion in franchising. Thank you so much.
You're more than welcome. Glad to be a participant.
And thanks to both of you for that conversation. Very interesting. Next session, Judith Williams heads up the award-winning diversity and inclusion team at SAP. Prior to SAP, she directed the unconscious bias work stream at Google to help employees make objective decisions and facilitate inclusive interactions. Judith, great to see you. In fact, good to see you again, because I saw you when I was in my old job way back when you were doing Google stuff. But now you're at SAP, one of the greatest, people, just so they know, SAP is one of the largest data management systems in the world. I go back 20, 30 years with Hasso Plattner, who was, a legendary early player in SAP. I guess my question to you is, when you come into a company like SAP, what are the first things you put in place that you achieve to try to get real commitment and real buy-in and diversity inclusion?
So one of the things that you've hit on, and I want to thank you for inviting me to talk, first of all, but one of the things that you've hit on is that we are a data and analytics company, right? We put the systems in place that allow companies to manage their workforces, to manage their supply chain, to do their enterprise resource planning. And so if you want to have credibility at a company like SAP, you want to start with the data and the analytics. Right. So you want to say, what is the data that we have collected, and what is the insight that we can gain from the data, and then put metrics in place so you make it very clear that you are speaking the same language as the business and that you see inclusion challenges as fundamental business problems.
So, and so when you start there and you're kind of looking at your, basically committed diversity inclusion at a company as big as SAP, what are some of the other dimensions when you're trying to sort of knock open doors inside your own company, but also talk to others about it? What are some of those pathways?
Well, you start with the data and you say, look, we have some gaps, right? We may have gaps in our representation and leadership. We may have gaps in our representation of certain demographics. And then you look at what could be the root causes of some of those. And you have conversations with leaders about their organizations to find out, are they seeing the talent in their pipeline, in the diversity of the talent in their pipeline so that they have the opportunity to hire? Are they developing the diversity on their team? And from there, you can build a strategy and a set of tactics that help you solve each of those discrete problems, and starting with the data for each leader so they understand what's going on in their organization. You may have an organization of over 20,000 people. It's really hard to understand exactly what the problems are and what the gaps are in inclusion without looking at the data and then having those database conversations. Then you can focus and say, okay, for this part of the organization, we are going to look at a broad spectrum. So in the US, of course, we are really focused right now on issues of racial justice and ethnic diversity. And we've made some outstanding strides in terms of changing our CSR strategy and investing in organizations like the organizations that are dedicated to racial and social justice. But we also have to look inside our house and say, what does our leadership diversity look like in the US? What does our pipeline of people of color look like in the US? Because for a long time, when you're a global company, you might say, okay, we can focus on gender globally, but you have to have those specific conversations that are related to the demographics where we operate. So our conversations with, for example, our head of North America is going to look very different than our conversations with our team back in Germany.
Right. Well, thank you for that. I'm interested in your work as well, Judith, on unconscious work bias and unconscious bias in general. I mean, it's one of the things we started our conversation today with a member of Congress who's been working hard to get basically commitment to diversity in the U.S. military in the National Defense Authorization Act. And if you look at the command staff, for instance, of the military, it's white guys. So they have had it, and you kind of come in and see them in Congress. The broad question is, how do you begin undoing a system of both unconscious bias, the patterns that people have, and begin to move them? So taking off just the diversity hat, but as you think about unconscious work bias, what are some of the things for those listening to this show today that can be practically done to move a company or an institution forward?
So when we look at our unconscious biases, right, they're unconscious, and that's a huge challenge. And so again, what we have to look at is, say, if we see an outcome like the one that you described in the U.S. military, where all of the leaders of an organization look the same way, and that's not representative of the whole of the organization. So you have a very different leadership base than you do in the organization. Then you look at that and you say something is happening here, and unconscious bias is probably playing out in the types of decisions that we make. And our unconscious biases play out in every type of decision. So it's not only our official decisions about who we promote to the next job, but it's also who we decide on our team is going to get the most high profile project. Often I talk to managers and they'll say, well, I have a go-to person on my team because I know that person will always get the job done. But when we do that, what we are essentially doing is overdeveloping one type of talent on our team and underdeveloping other talent on our team. And as leaders, it's really important that we distribute opportunity more fairly. So one thing that I say to leaders is, when you get that high profile opportunity, think not who's the go-to person on my team, but who is the person on my team that really needs an opportunity to develop. Now, that might be a little bit more work for me as a leader or a manager, because I have to coach and mentor them. But that's actually my job as a manager, to coach and mentor my team. And if I have a team with 1 or 2 stars and that's all I focus on, I'm not actually being a good leader or a good manager. So I always tell managers, think about distributing those development opportunities even before we get to the promotion discussion or any of those official decisions.
Let me ask you, Judith, how big of a hurdle is this now? Are things moving the right direction? Let me tell you a little bit of a story. I knew your former CEO, Bill McDermott, pretty well, and we'd meet in Davos at the World Economic Forum, meet people like Beth Brooke, the former vice chairman of Ernst & Young, EY, and various people. And a couple of the agendas they had, getting more women leadership speaking and on the program at Davos, getting more LGBTQ plus representatives in programs and in things. And the truth is, when we would have LGBTQs, they would be at the Microsoft, pod or the EY pod, not in the central operation. So there's sort of this, I call it the fig leaf problem, which is sometimes institutions, they put 8 women as the co-chairs of Davos one year, but they did very little in terms of attendees or on top of, speakers throughout the program. It was just remarkable. So I guess my question to you is, do you feel like we're moving in the right direction generally, or do we have to do things that sort of embarrass those that are pretending to be committed to diversity but really aren't?
Well, I mean, we know that shame doesn't actually change behavior. So I don't know that we want to embarrass people. But what we can point out is that sometimes we have some structural inequities that we have to correct. So if we think about Davos, for example, we know there's such a hierarchy at Davos, and that a lot of the individuals who end up with the white badges are people at the C level in some of the largest companies in the world, right? Or people who are board members for some of those companies. And so what we see is that the pool from which we draw of who can speak and who can show up is already very shallow. And then we think about the perverse incentives that we can create. And so at Davos, if you're a strategic partner, you can bring 4 people and get them white badges. But if you have a woman, you get a 5th one. And so what you end up having is these delegations where they're 20% women. And if you look at Davos, it's about 20% women, because rather than saying, hey, how do we diversify our entire delegation? You have all these organizations that are like, oh, we'll just bring one more woman. And so when your pool is already shallow, it's really hard. So what we have to think is, how do we diversify lower down in the funnel? How do we change the number of women CEOs? At the beginning of this year, we had 4 African-American Fortune 500 CEOs. Now we have 3. And that number has been declining. So are we making progress? It depends on the metric. I would say we are having this conversation. We're having the conversation a lot, but we haven't seen the outcomes that we want. We have to see action, and we have to have accountability, and not just accountability for our intent, but accountability for our impact and the outcomes that we're driving.
I really appreciate your perspective. Results matter, data matters. Judith Williams, SVP, Diversity Inclusion, SAP. I'll just say one thing. I appreciate your thing, and shame doesn't do it. I was helping to run a think tank. I would tell, my fellows that were in there working, said, your job is to embarrass the bad decisions of government and then to put a better idea on the table. And I kind of hear that in what you're suggesting and that we do. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for the opportunity. I've enjoyed it.
Big corporations and local governments are recognizing that diverse hiring practices are really critical to their success. Arlington County, Virginia, created a position this past summer to specifically advance racial equity within the community. And as an organization, it wanted to address systemic racism, where it shows up in policies and procedures. I'm calling on my colleague, Julia Manchester, fantastic colleague, the Hill's political reporter, for this next interview. Julia, I wish you were here in the studio, but I know you're home. Have fun.
Thank you so much, Steve. Samia Bird, thank you so much for joining me for this session. Just for our viewers at home so they know, Samia was appointed Chief Race and Equity Officer for Arlington County in July of 2020, shortly after the George Floyd tragedy and racial tensions really erupted in the United States. She's also the Deputy County Manager at Arlington County. Samia, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
So just to start off with, why did Arlington County bring this new role into the fold this past summer? Was this something that had been in the making, or was this a response to the broader conversation we saw about race in the United States really start this summer?
Arlington County, this position actually had been in the making for at least a year or so. As an organization, we had started having conversations about race, specifically around equity, for about 2 years prior to this year. We had been doing some learning. We had been talking as a leadership team and leadership group about the importance of advancing race and equity within government. And when we had been working in 2018, 2019 on health equities, one of our steering committees for Destination 2027, one of their recommendations was that we should really consider having a position that was really specifically focused on equity. And so we had been talking about that. We had a group of staff that were participating in a learning cohort program with the Government Alliance on Race and Equity and the Metropolitan Washington Council of Governments, very specifically learning about advancing race and equity in government. And we wanted to give them an opportunity to go through that program so that we really understood what a position or a role such as mine would be about and what it would actually be intended to do. And so the time just seemed right. They finished the program. We had conversations as leadership, and then everything started happening this summer. And a lot of the departments within the organization were doing a lot of work on their own to try to address equity and racial equity within their departments. And we felt like it was the right time to go ahead and advance that position.
Absolutely. And, what are some of the specific trends you've seen deployed in government and public offices really across the country to bring more thought and attention to the issues of race and equity in this country?
A lot of discussions very specifically on race, privilege, bias, and how that shows up in our divisions and our lines of business as serving government, serving the community in the areas of focus that we have. A lot of training around racial equity and understanding the history of race and government. And in our specific departments, what are the policies and the procedures that have been put in place that are race-based that may produce racialized outcomes and disparities for the people that we serve. So we're seeing a lot of that. I would know in the metropolitan region in Washington, D.C., specifically focusing on race and government with organizations such as the Government Alliance on Race and Equity. We have been very specific and strategic to focus on having these conversations within our departments and then looking at how we might be able to use an equity lens or an equity tool that we can apply to budget decisions in terms of allocations and resources, that we can apply every step of the way when we're making decisions about policies, practices, our projects and programs, and even how we engage with the community and some of the work that we're doing around them. So it's really very much focused on that equity lens and having an equity mindset when we approach the work that we do in serving the community.
Absolutely. And, when my team and I were prepping for this panel, we came across one news story from this past summer. Essentially, chalkwork art by an African-American Arlington family was put on display outside of their home supporting the Black Lives Matter movement, and public works officials essentially needed to wash it away, kind of dismissed it as graffiti, later apologized. It seems like there have been situations like this across the country that really seem kind of thoughtless and almost, in some cases very malicious. How do you prevent, or how do we all work to prevent situations like this happening in localities across the country?
By looking at the policies. So we have a lot of policies that have been created that we enact and then we implement, and people just go about doing their jobs based on policy. But have we taken the time to understand whether or not those policies are really benefiting or burdening people of color or people who are marginalized? I don't know that we've done that. And so that's one instance where there's a policy in place that essentially says, you clean the graffiti if it's in the public right of way. However, there was no thought about the content of that and what the purpose of it was. Well, that's not embedded in the policy. So having that understanding and being able to have those conversations about the impacts of having minority employees in particular have to do that work and implement it and what that may mean to them, but also the content of that. We're not able to necessarily have those conversations, but if we understand that there are policies in place that people have to enact, that they may have some racist tone to them or some racist background, then we might be able to be a little bit more sensitive about, okay, well, what are the procedures? What are the processes that we need to reconsider to make sure that we don't have those types of outcomes in the future?
Absolutely. And we only have a few minutes left, but, I wanted to touch on this one thing I've observed. It seems like a lot of companies, a lot of local governments, sectors of government, they've embraced really making race and equity a priority. However, for some organizations and companies, maybe some local governments, there seems to be a bit of a hesitation or somewhat of a concern about moving forward in this direction. I mean, sometimes you hear this dismissed as political correctness, but it's really so much more than that, obviously, and it's a huge issue. How do we get those organizations that have these hesitations to understand the importance of race and equity and why companies and these groups need to understand that?
Well, it's hard, right? Conversations and just focusing and centering work around race is difficult for all of us. It's a challenge. It's always been the elephant in the room. It's always been the thing that we've never wanted to talk about or address, but it's the most pervasive. And so having that conversation where we just start at the very basic level of understanding what race is and how it came to be and how it came to be in government and what our role is in a system that none of us here created, but we're all a part of, is important. So it's that education piece, it's that awareness piece, and understanding that we're not looking to attack individuals in institutions, but we're looking to attack a system that produces racialized outcomes, and understanding that when we can address the system, everyone benefits, not just the people who are most impacted, but everyone. So targeting our strategies so that people know that what we're focusing on is the most pervasive, but with the purpose of creating solutions and outcomes that are better for everyone.
Absolutely. Well, Samia Bird, thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. I really, truly hope that other people across the country look at the Washington metropolitan area and see figures like you and realize that it's possible to really change their own localities and incorporate a lot of that discussion on race and equity.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Steve, back to you.
Samia, thank you, and thank you, Julia. And Samia, I'm just across the river, so I want to come check things out down there one of these days. Okay?
Excellent. Be happy to have you.
Nice to see you. Thank you. Okay, many people absolutely love their professional sports teams, but most likely don't consciously think of their favorite leagues as businesses or entities with workplace structures, rules, and challenges. The noticeable and positive actions taken by our next guest this summer after the George Floyd tragedy, I should say George Floyd murder and tragedy, showed leadership in a time of social, emotional, and cultural crisis in the United States. Michelle Roberts is the executive director of the NBA Players Association and is the first woman to head a major professional sports union in North America. Wow. Tony Clark is executive director of the Major League Baseball Players Association. He's a former Major League Baseball first baseman, like a really good one. Tony played for 15 years. And Terry Carmichael Jackson is executive director of the Women's National Basketball Players Association. Most recently, prior Terry was the director of law policy and governance at the National Collegiate Athletic Association. It's great to be with all of you. And I need to tell you right up front that what I love all this sports, my sport, I grew up in Japan, is sumo. So that's an entirely other show one day. But let me just start with you, Michelle. As we kind of look at this dashboard, we're talking diversity, inclusion, how to make it real, but we're sitting on top of a set of storms in this country. One is the storm of what happened around the country, not just George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, just a lot of issues that have. And honestly, those are the highlights because we've seen racial injustice, police brutality for a long period of time. It's just come to the surface and people are saying, hey, it's time to do something. But we have economic inequality. We have the COVID crisis that has hit unevenly in this country. And I just, as the head of a sports association, sports union, what do your players want? What is the right thing to do amidst these storms from your perspective?
It's been a hell of a year, huh?
A hell of a year.
What's not too terribly interesting, but certainly predictable about what the players were doing this year was feeling the very same things that every member of the community has felt. I mean, I'm old enough to know that this is probably not going to be resolved tomorrow, but it's been going on for a long time. The good news is that our players are not content to simply hope that things get better. They've made a decision that they are going to be actively engaged in trying to make it better. And so I couldn't be prouder of them. This is not an initiative that's been created by me. The players are not led. They, frankly, I can barely keep up with them. But the good news is that our community, our players are making very clear that notwithstanding the privileges that they've been able to attain, they feel a responsibility and they intend to do something about making their communities better. Couldn't be prouder.
Yeah, but Michelle, who do you have to do, I hate to put it in these terms, who do you have to do battle with or who do you have to bring over to your side by way of owners, by way of audience and fans? by way of other players that may not be on board. How hard a process is that to get a consensus that this is the right moment, the right set of actions, and right commitments of your players and workers?
Maybe you may think it's remarkable, but it hasn't been that difficult. And that's something that I'm encouraged by. I didn't have to go into a fight or a meeting with the league and fight about what would be the right thing to do would be. Obviously we have some fans that disagree with some of the statements and positions that our players have taken, but I'm crossing my fingers, because the good news is, as a labor issue, it's not become one that I've had to really take up arms about. I mean, the league has been in lockstep with us thus far, and I'm encouraged by that.
Well, thank you. Tony, let me ask you the same question. Tony Clark, as you sit in the middle of this, and you have all of you have so many high-profile members, what do you want the world to know about this set of pressures that they're feeling and this moment we're in?
Well, I think, as Michelle offered and represented, our players are a microcosm of the communities that they live in. And so what we are all experiencing, they are experiencing as well. They simply have a much higher profile than most. But as Michelle highlighted as well, it's been encouraging to be a part of the conversations that are being had. It's been encouraging and empowering to have the guys ask questions and want to be a part of the solution. Again, there's a lot of work to be done, but as Ms. Bird offered on previously here on the show, the idea that questions are being asked and conversations are being had is beneficial in understanding how we got here, how it is that it's manifesting itself, and Lord willing, how we can all be a part of the solution moving forward. But without those conversations, without that recognition, it makes it very difficult to appreciate what has been done, what needs to be done, and what direction needs to be taken moving forward. But our guys are having those conversations, and again, I'm very encouraged by it.
Tony, before I jump to our other colleague here, Terry, let me ask you I'm going to just ask you point blank because I don't know. From your perspective, how much is racial bias, racial discrimination still an issue within sports franchises?
Very much so. As I've offered on parts of previous discussions, anytime I'm in a room and we're having a conversation with the league or with a club, very rarely, if at all, am I ever sitting across from someone who looks like me, or comes from where I came from, or who's had the experiences that I've had. And it's a challenge that has been there for a long time. It's a challenge that many recognize. And yet, as we sit here in November of 2020, not near enough has changed and been reflective of the changes that need to be made in the tough discussions, again, with the league and with the teams that needs to be had. So it's very prevalent. It's unfortunate. It is a part of the fabric that exists, but remain hopeful that, again, as we have our conversations, that change can indeed be afoot.
Thank you for that. Terry, I am very aware that you live in a world where there's just, built-in discrimination on pay, treatment. With a lot of your players, one of the most powerful events I had the privilege to moderate happened to be not only basketball players, but soccer and a variety of women in sports. And you sort of look at the franchise they had, the impact and popularity they had nationally. But when you look at their level of pay and compensation, it was ridiculous. So I'd love to give you a chance to share with us what inequities you think are still out there that ought to be highlighted.
Well, you started with one of the number ones that we talk about, of course, pay. We also like to see, there's the inequity around women just generally. We don't see enough of us at the table when we are in collective bargaining, although I will say this time around there were many more of us at the table, and that led to very positive results.
But I think, for us, those are the top two. And those are the ones that we focus on. Those are the ones that we continue to talk about and have conversations about. And we look to foster some change. I think the recent collective bargaining agreement that we just negotiated gives us that opportunity to drive that kind of change, to have the necessary conversations around equity in the workplace, fairness to workers, and it's definitely around pay, and definitely about having more women represented at senior levels of management.
What I love about this conversation, three of you, is that, I think this is not a kumbaya discussion. We have lawyers, we have union leaders, we have, negotiators in I can just hear in the tone from all of you that this requires education. It also requires lawsuits. It may require strikes. It may require action. What can those of us that are outside your world do to be more connected to your efforts to create civic justice on these fronts, economic justice, gender justice, racial justice? Michelle?
Demanding it from the leagues. Tony and Terry made the point. Our players are predominantly of color. Management is not predominantly of color. And to the extent our fans agree that diversity and inclusion are important parts of the American fabric, they need to demand that from the league. It should not be the case that we have to have rules requiring teams to interview people of color. Our fans need to make clear their disdain for discrimination. And so if anyone wants to help, then write a letter to the owner of the team in your neighbor in your community and say, I want to make sure that fill in the blank team is engaged in inclusive hiring practices. That's the very first thing you can do. And then when there are players that are engaged in those discussions and wanting to amplify those arguments in their platforms, just retweet it, like it. Let the world know that we're in the same place and wanting to make sure that our sports are diverse, not simply on the field or in the court, but throughout. And so there's plenty of places to help out.
Tony?
Yeah, I don't know that I could say it much better. As Michelle highlighted, there has to be an interest and a desire to affect positive change. We can scream until we're blue in the face, but to the extent that there are those who are interested in seeing a level playing field, there are those who love and are committed to our game, watching it and being a part of it, that want to see a level playing field and opportunities abound. Your voice needs to be heard. And the hope is that the louder that drum beat becomes, the greater the likelihood that change will indeed happen.
Let me just ask all of you, and I'm going to bring in Terry on the front end of this. I recently did interviews with Dr. Cornel West, Angela Davis, Martin Luther King III, and Ibram X. Kendi. Very different perspectives. The first three seemingly looking at this as an inflection point, maybe looking hopeful that maybe some. Ibram Kendi, he basically said there's no consciousness that's deep enough yet about the racism that's embedded in our systems. And I'm just interested in how each of you feel about this moment. Terry, I'll start with you. Do you think we're moving in the right direction, or do you think the fight, that the challenges, I'm just thinking back to Angela Davis and what a role she played way back when. But she sort of says, we see women ascending, we see a different kind of validation. But if you talk to other folks, they don't see that, they don't share that. They worry that we are back in a hopeful moment that will disappear as people get distracted by other things.
I think that's a great question. And of course, I think that we are moving in the right direction. Do I think that there is more to be done? Absolutely. Do I think that there's an incredible journey ahead? Absolutely. But I think, as you look at the events most recently that have rocked this nation, they give me hope. They give me hope, and my players give me hope. In addition to what Tony and Michelle said about, how to drive change, we need folks also listening to the players. They have amazing voices. They are incredibly thoughtful on the key issues. Listen to the players. Follow the players on social media, as Michelle suggested, and amplify their messages and amplify their voice. I'm going to go back to, our CBA negotiations and the events of late. And, the players have been talking and saying the time is now. They recognize the time is now to make change. And we are driving the necessary critical conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion that need to happen right now. And they're looking to see policy change, significant policy change across the teams and across the league. So I am hopeful that our fans, who are as diverse as our players, and understand the issues like our players, I'm hopeful that they will amplify that voice so we can just keep this momentum moving forward.
Thank you for that. Tony, let me jump to you because I also want to respect the fact that you played Major League 15 years, Detroit Tigers, all of that. I mean, you lived through all of this and you're living now, it preceded in an earlier time. But how do you see it? I mean, are you hopeful at this moment, or you think we're fooling ourselves?
Well, I try to be a glass half full guy. But truth be told, from the time that I came into the game, to now, we've seen a dramatic shift, and we've seen the challenges that were underlying perhaps 20 years ago reveal themselves in a fashion that's to the detriment of our industry. It's to the detriment of each of us involved as we try to move our game forward. So, am I hopeful? Yes. As Terry shared, I think each of us have seen things over the course of the last year or so that are markedly different than what we had seen in the years preceding. Conversations that are being had now that weren't being had as often or as in the forefront as they are now are encouraging. The how we got here has taken a long time. How we get out of it is going to take a while too. But as long as there is a desire and a commitment to affecting that change, we're going to give ourselves a chance to build each day toward a better future. But there's no doubt that those have been fighting the fight for as long as they've been fighting it, that some of them may be a little apprehensive or a little unsure about where we are and where we're going based on those experiences. It's understandable. But truly I'm holding on to the fact that whether it's panels like this, whether it's conversations that I'm having personally or those that are a part of our industry and workplace, they are different than I've seen in some time, and I am encouraged by that.
That's great. That's great. I'm a 1/4 full, 3/4 empty kind of guy, but on most things. But Michelle, I know a lot of union leaders. It's a real pleasure to meet you. There's not a union leader I know that's not a storm of optimism and frustration all tied together. But what's your take?
The good news is that we've had activism among athletes throughout our history, but there's no question, but we're at a place now that is unparalleled. I mean, the power that the athletes have, their voices have never been as strong and as powerful as they are now. And I'm not afraid to admit that a lot of it has to do with social media. I mean, the ability to be able to reach out to millions of people on a dime is power. And it's something that I suppose we need to thank technology for, but the bottom line is not only do they have the power, but these athletes are exercising it. And so while I agree, there's a long way to go, we have moved by leaps and bounds in terms of the power and the leverage that athletes have to be able to affect change. I'm glad I'm alive to see it.
Well, I am too, and I'm grateful for you guys sharing this. We are taking audience questions, and we have a question for you from Carolyn Vilvardi. And Carolyn is the Senior Associate Strategic Communications at the Opportunity Finance Network. Carolyn?
For my question, I'm wondering, as athletes are becoming more savvy around investing and entrepreneurial pursuits, while also becoming much more active in their pursuits of addressing social issues, particularly around closing the racial wealth gap, I'm wondering if teams and leagues and organizations like the players' associations for the various leagues are providing guidance to athletes in helping them navigate where to direct their money and make investments that align with their values, and making sure that they can help address some of these issues that they care about, such as closing the racial wealth gap. So if you could provide an answer to that, I would really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you, Caroline. That's a lot there, but a little bit of social change, a little bit of entrepreneurship. Tony, let me start with you.
Well, what's important, at least what we've come to appreciate as important, is making sure that the players have the information they need to make the decisions that they're interested in making, whether that's on the field or off the field. We are diligent, but remarkably careful in regards to providing financial support and guidance. That's not really what we do, but to the extent that players have questions about businesses that are out there and are asking for diligence to be done against the backdrop of an individual or a business and what it's about, we can provide those tools and that information such that they are equipped to make the decisions they want to make. But we don't look to allocate player money in any one direction. We afford them an opportunity to make those decisions themselves.
That makes sense to me. Michelle, quick thoughts?
Yeah, same thing. And a number of our players actually are very much engaged in the creations of funds. They are keen on wanting to do something about the economic inequality in our country. Tony's right. I mean, we don't find ourselves engaged in financial advice, but we do a lot of due diligence. And the good news, and I'll stop, is we do have a foundation that not only assists players in providing funds for some of the areas that they're interested in, but we also provide some education in that regard, and just being able to have folks understand what an empowerment zone is, and what sorts of ventures they can engage in that will help to promote small businesses or women's businesses or businesses of color. So we don't sort of shepherd their money in any particular space, but we do act as a resource to make sure that they have the information they need if they want to engage in that kind of giving.
It's always dangerous mentioning, specific names, but one of the people who's done an extraordinary job, I think, over the many years, is Magic Johnson. When you look at, here I'm in Washington, D.C., what he's done for franchise owners, employment, changing the nature of cities, and I just wish we could bottle it and, kind of move it everywhere. Maybe that's happening, but there are, to Caroline's point, very, very impressive things. Terry, I'm going to give you the last word.
I love Caroline's question. As Tony and Michelle say, we're a players association. We stay in our lane and don't look to get too involved in the conversations around finance and what players do with their wealth. But we will be there and ready to answer any questions that they have. The balance of influence for athletes has shifted quite dramatically, and from my perspective, is continuing to shift quite dramatically for professional women athletes. Athlete activism certainly is not new. It's been around for years and years, decades and decades, and we've seen it mostly in recent months. But what is new is the fundamental way in which leagues and teams and fans respond to our athletes and the social, political statements that they're looking to make, and how they're responding to them and supportive of them. And so I'm just so pleased to see that. I think we're moving in a positive direction. We at the Players Association are there to support our members in any of their ventures. And again, always there to answer their questions and provide them with whatever information they need to make good choices.
Can I ask three of you, I'm going to frustrate my producers and squeeze in one more question. I was speaking the other day at Monsef Slaoui, who is the chief advisor for Operation Warp Speed. I had a conversation with Congressman Brad Wenstrup, a Republican from Ohio, and Donna Shalala, a Democrat from Florida, both House members. And we were talking about the collapse of trust by a lot of people in what we might get by way of a vaccine. Someday we're going to get vaccines that are efficacious and safe with responding to COVID-19. And it was discussed there about trusted ambassadors going into communities of color with whomever they would. And people were talking about the power, as Michelle just said, of sports figures with this. Do you think when we get to the point where there's a trustable vaccine responding to this terrible pandemic of COVID-19, your communities are going to be part of that process of helping people to get a bridge back to that? I mean, I know I'm putting you on the spot on that, but Michelle, you made me think about it. So, Michelle?
Yeah, so put me on the spot. Well, the key is trusted, right? The one thing that I've been, frankly, this has been top of mind for a couple of days now that we've got these two at least promising vaccines. In our community, vaccinations are viewed with some skepticism. And
right. My
concern is that that's going to inhibit members of our community from being willing to partake of it. But once it is, the answer is yes. If there's a reason to understand and believe that this is a way to save lives, then I would not imagine that our players would not be willing and able and anxious to get the word out. All of us are devastated by this virus, and if we can do anything to assist the community in recovery, we're there.
Well, thank you for that. You triggered it. Well, Terry and Tony, any quick thoughts on that front? Terry?
I agree with Michelle. It's in the DNA of professional athletes to be these kinds of leaders and to get the word out. If we get to a place with trust, with new leadership in an incoming administration, I'm very hopeful that our players will step up once again and be ambassadors in this effort.
Tony Clark, last word. Real last word.
All I was going to add was again to highlight the ability to separate fact from fiction. It's unfortunate that the uncertainty exists in any number of things we're navigating as a community and as a nation. Our hope is that with respect to the vaccine moving forward, that the facts on the ground match the facts that are indeed accurate, such that the decision to be involved and be interested in being involved and spreading the good news can be something we can all get behind.
Well, look, my producers are about to get the hook from me, but this conversation was worth risking their wrath, I think. Really appreciate your comments, your candor. Michelle Roberts, Executive Director of the NBA Players Association. Tony Clark, Executive Director of the Major League Baseball Players Association. Terry Carmichael Jackson, Executive Director of the WNBA Players Association. I hope you come back and play with me again on these issues, because I love this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
That brings us to the end of our second session today. A big thank you to Qualcomm, the International Franchise Association, and the National Association of Realtors for their support, and to all of you in the audience for joining us. We're not done yet. I'm not done yet. I'm going to be back, whether you want me or not. 3:30 p.m. Eastern. Please come back here for the third and final session of our Diversity and Inclusion Summit, where we will discuss building a culture of equity. Our powerhouse speakers include Reverend William Barber. Oh my gosh, he is fantastic. And Representative Deb Haaland, and many more. I'm Steve Clemens. See you back here in just a bit.